So the Attorney General of the United States just confirmed, under oath, on camera, in front of Congress, that there is a list that is not public, a list that is not formally disclosed, a list that is not subject to any clearly defined transparency mechanism, a list of Americans and organizations the government is internally labeling as domestic threats. And when directly asked by a member of Congress, the body whose constitutional role is to oversee executive power, whether that list could be shared, the response was not procedural. It was not classified justification. It was not, "We will review this in a closed session." It was a refusal, flat, direct, unambiguous. She would not say who is on it. She would not explain how someone gets placed on it. She would not outline how anyone could be removed from it. And she would not commit to providing it to Congress. Let that sink in for a moment, because this was not a leak. This was not anonymous reporting. This was not speculation built on unnamed sources. This was sworn testimony, under oath, on camera, in a formal congressional oversight hearing. And the moment the questioning moved toward the existence and structure of that list, the tone of the exchange shifted dramatically, from routine oversight into something far more revealing. Before breaking down the legal implications, the procedural significance, and why experts across legal and civil liberties circles immediately flagged this exchange as unusually consequential, you need to see the moment that triggered the entire controversy.
Recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bondi, I'm here. On September 25th, President Trump signed a memorandum known as NSPM 7, purporting to address domestic terrorism. But Americans across the political spectrum were immediately alarmed by the memo's blurring of the line between unlawful conduct and constitutionally protected speech and activity, as well as its call to investigate, prosecute, and dismantle groups that the president and Stephen Miller described without evidence as, quote, an organized campaign of radical left terrorism. Now, counterterrorism experts were further alarmed by the administration's singular focus on left-wing extremism, combined with the sudden deletion from the DOJ website of decades of research and law enforcement analysis, which had concluded that right-wing extremism poses the greatest terrorism threat to Americans. The president's memo broadly and vaguely links violent conduct to ideologies, and it targeted specifically anti-American, anti-Christian, and anti-capitalist beliefs, as well as, quote, hostility to so-called traditional American views on family, religion, and morality, end quote. President Trump has repeatedly and openly, however falsely, tried to brand his political opponents with these sentiments listed in his memo. But as you know, as a lawyer, holding beliefs that the White House disagrees with is not a crime. And the statute defining domestic terrorism requires criminal acts, not just thoughts and ideas. That's why legal experts, nonprofit leaders, religious freedom, and civil rights advocates immediately raised the alarm that the new presidential directive was a politically motivated attack on civil society designed to silence those who disagree with the administration. So, Ms. Bondi, Section 3 of that memo directed you, as Attorney General, to submit to the President and Stephen Miller a list of groups or entities whose members are engaged in acts that meet the definition of domestic terrorism. And then on December 4th, you directed the FBI to work with a variety of law enforcement entities to compile a list of groups and entities engaged in such acts by January 3rd, 2026, and to update that report every 30 days thereafter. So can we assume that you or persons under your direction at the Department of Justice have prepared that list of groups or entities who are designated as domestic terrorist organizations? And I just remind you that's a yes or no question. Did you prepare the list?
I'm not going to answer it yes or no, but what I will say is I know Antifa is part of that. I will talk to you about that.
I'm reclaiming my time. I asked you whether you
an
prepared
Antifa member
a
was
list.
Arrested in Minneapolis federal
reclaiming
court for
my
cyber
time.
stalking.
Did you
they
have
ask a question
list?
and don't want an answer.
The answer is yes or no.
Time belongs to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Gentlelady can proceed.
Okay. So will you commit to providing this committee with any list of organizations that you have recommended be designated as domestic terrorist organizations?
We will comply with the law in all matters.
Will you commit to provide this committee with your list of entities that you recommend be designated as domestic terrorist organizations?
I'm not going to commit to anything to you because you won't let me answer questions.
Okay, well then, we do understand that your current position is that you have a secret list of people or groups that you are accusing of domestic terrorism, but you won't share it with Congress. And I'd remind you that when the U.S. government designates an entity as a foreign terrorist organization, it must report that to Congress and to the entity, because the government can make a mistake and the entity has the opportunity to contest it. So your position seems to be that if you falsely designate an American or an American organization as a terrorist group, there's nothing they can do about it. I think we get it. You don't want to answer the
No,
question.
you don't get anything regarding public safety.
Thank you.
Nothing.
Thank you for the insult. It's clear you didn't come to Congress prepared to answer questions that the American people have every right to have answered. But if you were to prepared to answer truthfully, here's what we expect the facts to show. The administration is keeping lists of Americans who the White House says are engaged in domestic terrorism. Those lists could include Americans who have not committed any acts of terrorism, but simply disagree with this administration, people like Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And your list may include clergy, elected officials, and members of indivisible groups across the country. And those lists likely don't include Proud Boys or Oath Keepers who were actually convicted. Americans have never tolerated political demagogues who use the government to punish people on an enemies list. It brought down McCarthy. It brought down Nixon.
Now watch closely, not just what is said, but what is not said. Because in oversight hearings, silence, deflection, and refusal to answer direct procedural questions often tell a far bigger story than the statements themselves. What was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing quickly became a constitutional flashpoint the moment the questioning turned to a specific presidential memorandum. On paper, hearings like this follow a predictable structure. Congress asks questions. Executive officials answer them under oath. Clarifications are entered into the record. Oversight is exercised. That is not political theater. That is the constitutional design. But this hearing stopped being routine the second the Attorney General was asked about a directive ordering the creation of a domestic threat list. Not a vague policy discussion, not a broad security initiative, a specific directive, a specific operational task, a specific list. And here is the detail that fundamentally changes the legal stakes. The memorandum in question did not describe a theoretical framework. It explicitly instructed federal agencies, under the supervision of the Department of Justice, to compile and update an ongoing list of groups and entities associated with domestic threat activity. That means the central question posed during the hearing was not complex. It was not abstract. It was not rhetorical. It was procedurally simple. Did the Department of Justice compile the list it was directed to create? Yes or no? That framing matters enormously in congressional testimony. A yes or no structure is not accidental. It is a legal technique designed to prevent narrative detours and force clarity under oath. When a witness answers directly, the record becomes precise. When a witness avoids the answer, the record becomes revealing in a different way. And what followed was not a direct confirmation. It was not a denial. It was a pivot. Instead of addressing the existence of the list in procedural terms, the response shifted toward rhetorical framing, partial acknowledgement, and strategic redirection. The Attorney General did not explicitly deny the directive. She did not state that no list existed. She did not explain the statutory authority behind such a list. She referenced specific ideological groups. She reframed the question. She challenged the premise of the inquiry itself. This is a known pattern in high-stakes testimony. Dodge, redirect, reframe. If a direct answer is never given, a direct record is never created. But then came the moment that escalated the exchange beyond routine oversight tension. The Congresswoman, maintaining procedural clarity, asked whether the committee, the formal oversight body, would be provided access to any list of organizations designated or analyzed under this framework. This is where national security protocol typically enters the conversation. Officials often respond with phrases like, "We can discuss that in a classified setting," subject to legal review. in accordance with disclosure protocols. None of those procedural safeguards were invoked. Instead, the response was a refusal to commit to providing the information at all. That distinction is not semantic, it is constitutional. Because congressional oversight is not optional, it is a foundational mechanism embedded in the separation of powers. When executive agencies take actions that may impact civil liberties, organizational activity, or protected forms of expression, Congress has both the authority and the responsibility to ask fundamental questions. What is being done? Under what legal authority? With what criteria? And with what accountability safeguards? So when an attorney general acknowledges operational activity related to a threat designation framework while simultaneously declining to disclose its structure to Congress, the issue immediately expands beyond partisan debate. It becomes a governance question, and that is precisely what unfolded in real time during the hearing. The Congresswoman did not begin with accusations. She began with legal context. She referenced the presidential memorandum addressing domestic terrorism. She cited expert concerns about blurred lines between unlawful conduct and constitutionally protected speech. She clarified that domestic terrorism statutes are rooted in criminal acts, not beliefs or ideological positions. This methodical setup was not rhetorical flourish, it was record building. In congressional hearings, laying out legal context before asking a direct question establishes the evidentiary framework. It ensures that any response, or refusal to respond, is interpreted within a documented legal scope. Then came the core question again: clear, direct, procedurally narrow. Did the Department of Justice compile the list of groups or entities engaged in acts that meet the statutory definition of domestic terrorism as directed? And once again, the answer was not a direct confirmation or denial. Instead, the exchange shifted toward procedural tension. Questions were reframed, time was reclaimed, clarifications were deflected, intent was challenged. This is not unusual in contentious hearings, but the turning point came when the issue of transparency was explicitly addressed. When asked whether the list would be shared with Congress, the Attorney General did not invoke classification review, ongoing investigation constraints, or national security privilege in formal legal language. She declined to commit to providing it at all and framed the refusal in terms of public safety. That phrasing carries significant legal weight. Because invoking public safety while declining oversight disclosure creates a gray zone that legal scholars and constitutional analysts immediately scrutinize. Oversight and security are not mutually exclusive concepts within U.S. governance. Classified briefings exist precisely to balance transparency with security concerns, which raises a critical structural question. If the list exists and it cannot be shared publicly and it will not be shared with Congress, then what oversight mechanism governs it? That question, notably, was never directly answered. To understand why this exchange triggered such intense legal attention, it is necessary to examine the underlying framework of threat designation in U.S. law. There is a formal, codified process for designating foreign terrorist organizations. That process requires evidentiary review, interagency coordination, congressional notification, public designation in official records, and a legal pathway for the designated entity to challenge the designation in court. It is structured, documented, and legally defined. But for domestic organizations, there is no equivalent statutory system that allows the federal government to formally designate American groups as terrorist organizations in the same way. That absence is not an oversight, it is intentional. Because the Constitution protects freedom of speech, association, belief, and political expression, domestic threat assessments may exist within investigative frameworks, but formal ideological designation systems carry profound First Amendment implications if not grounded strictly in criminal conduct. And that is where the controversy surrounding the directive becomes legally significant. According to the language referenced during the hearing, the memorandum did not solely focus on acts of violence. It broadly connected threat indicators to ideological signals, including anti-capitalist rhetoric, hostility toward traditional institutional structures, and criticism of prevailing political or cultural frameworks. Here is the critical legal distinction that experts repeatedly emphasize. Beliefs are not crimes. Ideologies are not crimes. Speech, absent incitement to violence, is not a crime. Domestic terrorism statutes are tied to violent criminal acts and intent, not ideological identity or political disagreement. That is not a partisan interpretation. That is statutory reality. So, when oversight questions focus on whether a government-compiled list may involve ideological categorization rather than strictly criminal conduct, constitutional concerns escalate immediately. Another factor intensifying scrutiny is the contrast between past statements made during the Attorney General's confirmation hearing and the posture displayed during this oversight exchange. During confirmation, assurances of institutional neutrality, independence from political targeting, and adherence to legal restraint were explicitly emphasized. Fast forward to this testimony, and the record now reflects acknowledgement of a list framework, refusal to disclose criteria, refusal to commit to oversight transparency, dismissal of inquiry under public safety justification. That evolution is precisely what legal observers identify as a shift in institutional posture, not merely a disagreement in policy interpretation. Civil liberties organizations often use the term chilling effect when analyzing vague national security mechanisms. A chilling effect does not require arrests, prosecutions, or formal enforcement actions. It only requires uncertainty. If organizations believe they could be internally categorized as threats based on ideological positions, they may alter behavior preemptively. They may limit advocacy. They may reduce lawful speech. They may avoid public engagement, not because they have violated laws, but because the criteria governing scrutiny are unclear and undisclosed. Historically, such dynamics have appeared in multiple periods of governance where broad security frameworks intersected with political expression. Lawmakers referencing historical enemy lists during the hearing were not engaging in rhetorical exaggeration, but invoking documented examples of past government monitoring controversies that later became subjects of legal and institutional reform. Another layer of complexity emerged from reports that prior federal research assessing patterns of extremist violence was quietly removed from public-facing repositories shortly before the new directive's emphasis on specific ideological threat narratives. While the motivations for such removals remain debated, oversight bodies typically examine timing, policy shifts, and administrative actions collectively rather than in isolation. When research disappears, new frameworks emerge, and transparency declines simultaneously, oversight scrutiny intensifies as a matter of procedural responsibility. It is also important to understand that even if a domestic threat list lacks formal legal designation authority, it can still carry real-world consequences. Government signaling influences institutional risk calculations. Financial institutions, platforms, grant organizations, and compliance systems often respond to perceived regulatory risk, even in the absence of formal enforcement. This means that an internal label, even if not legally binding, can indirectly affect funding access, account stability, partnerships, and public credibility. In regulatory ecosystems, perception of risk can produce tangible operational outcomes. Supporters of proactive threat monitoring argue that evolving security landscapes require flexible analytical tools to identify emerging risks before they manifest in criminal activity. Critics counter that vague ideological indicators risk politicizing law enforcement analysis and blurring constitutional boundaries between protected belief and unlawful conduct. Both arguments exist within legitimate policy discourse. However, the oversight hearing was not debating theory. It was addressing operational reality. A directive exists. A list was referenced under oath. Transparency was declined. Oversight access was refused. And that sequence is what transformed a routine hearing into a broader constitutional conversation. Stripped of rhetoric and political framing, the central issue becomes structural rather than ideological. Can an executive authority maintain undisclosed internal lists categorizing domestic organizations as threats under broadly defined ideological indicators without a clearly defined statutory designation framework and without transparent oversight disclosure? That is the core legal question now being examined by analysts, lawmakers, and constitutional scholars alike. Where things stand based on sworn testimony and the hearing record is relatively clear. A directive related to compiling threat-linked organizational analysis exists. The Attorney General acknowledged elements of such analytical work. She declined to confirm disclosure mechanisms. She refused to outline inclusion criteria, and she dismissed oversight requests using public safety justification rather than formal classification procedure language.